Imagine two men. The first spends his life pumping gas and sweeping floors. He wears a coat held together with safety pins, chops his own firewood, and drives a second-hand car. When he dies in his 90s, the small town that barely noticed him discovers that this quiet janitor left behind a fortune of around $8 million, most of it given to the local hospital and library. The second man is a Harvard-educated executive who rose through the top ranks of a famous Wall Street firm. He owns a mansion with an indoor pool and elevators, and he is celebrated in the financial press as the picture of success. Then the crisis of 2008 arrives, the debts come due, and he loses nearly everything. There is no field of study where the man who cleaned toilets can quietly outperform the trained expert. There is no version of medicine or engineering where that happens. But it happens all the time with money. That single fact is the doorway into Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. His argument is disarmingly simple and quietly radical. Doing well with money has surprisingly little to do with how smart you are and almost everything to do with how you behave. It is a soft skill, where how you conduct yourself matters more than what you know. We treat investing and finance as though they were physics, full of formulas and precise rules. But money is not physics. Money is closer to psychology, to history, and to the messy, emotional, ego-driven creature that is the human being trying to feel safe, feel important, and sleep at night. Over the next stretch of time together, I want to walk through the ideas in this book, not as a lecture about rates of return, but as a study of behavior, patience, and perspective. Because in the end, the way you think about money will shape your life far more than any spreadsheet ever could. Morgan Housel published The Psychology of Money in the year 2020, and it went on to become one of the most widely read personal finance books of its era, translated into dozens of languages and passed hand-to-hand by people who normally never touch a finance book at all. That reach is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about what the book is and is not. It is not a technical manual. It contains almost no talk of price-to-earnings ratios or portfolio rebalancing schedules. Instead, it is built as a collection of short, self-contained chapters, each one telling a story or two and drawing out a single lesson about how people actually behave with their money. Housel is a former columnist who spent years writing about markets and investing, first for a well-known investing publication and later for a major financial newspaper, and he is a partner at a venture capital firm. But his real talent is not prediction or stock picking. It is noticing. He notices the gap between what the textbooks say people should do and what people actually do, and he treats that gap as the most important subject in all of finance. The book was published in the United Kingdom by Harriman House, and its success opened the door to his later work, including a 2023 book called Same as Ever, about the things in human nature that never change, and a 2025 book called The Art of Spending Money, about the choices that make a life feel richer. The context that matters most, though, is the intellectual stance he takes. Housel writes with humility about how little anyone can truly know about the future. He is deeply suspicious of the idea that finance is a solved science. And he keeps returning to a single organizing belief, which reviewers picked up on immediately. One review put it plainly, that financial decisions are shaped far more by human behavior than by data. Another praised how the book shows the way emotions and behavior, not spreadsheets, drive what we do with our money. That is the lens. Everything else in the book flows from it. The first big idea is one Housel returns to again and again, and it is more generous than most financial writing allows itself to be. His claim is that no one is truly crazy with money. People who make what look like insane financial decisions are usually making decisions that feel perfectly reasonable to them, based on their own unique experience of the world. Think about it this way. A person who grew up during a period of soaring prices and easy borrowing carries a completely different picture of how the world works than someone who came of age when prices were flat and jobs were scarce. Someone who watched their parents lose everything in a market crash will treat every investment with suspicion for the rest of their life, and no chart will ever fully talk them out of it. Someone who was born in a poor neighborhood, where the lottery ticket is the only visible path to a different life, is not being foolish when they buy one. They're buying a dream that people with more comfortable lives already own for free. Each of us has lived through only a tiny sliver of what has actually happened in the world, but that sliver feels like the whole story. We form our beliefs about risk, about greed, about what is safe and what is possible from the specific decades and circumstances we happen to be born into. And so when we look at someone else's choices and call them irrational, we are usually just failing to see the world through the lens of their experiences. This matters enormously because it means that money is never purely mathematical. Two intelligent, well-informed people can look at the same decision and reach opposite conclusions, and both can be behaving rationally given their histories. Housel's advice that grows out of this is to have some humility about your own views and some compassion for others, and to recognize that your relationship with money was partly shaped before you ever earned a dollar. The second idea is that we badly underestimate the role of luck and its shadow twin, risk. Housel tells the story of a man who, at the age of 13, happened to attend one of the only high schools in the entire world that had a computer at the time. That boy was Bill Gates, and he has openly said that without that specific, improbable stroke of access, there would have been no Microsoft. But there was another boy at that same school, equally brilliant, equally obsessed with computers, one of Gates's closest friends. Before he could graduate, that boy died in a mountaineering accident. Same school, same talent, same opportunity, wildly different fate. One became one of the richest people alive, and the other became a statistic, killed by a risk so rare that the odds of it were almost incomprehensibly small. Luck and risk are siblings. They are both the reality that the outcomes in our lives are guided by forces other than our own effort. We are quick to credit skill when things go well and quick to blame bad luck when things go badly, and we do the reverse when judging other people. But if you accept that luck plays a huge role in success, then you must also accept that risk, its mirror image, plays a huge role in failure. This has two practical consequences that Housel draws out. First, be careful who you praise and admire, and be careful who you look down on, because you may be assigning skill or foolishness to outcomes that were mostly chance. Second, and more usefully, focus less on specific individuals and case studies and more on broad patterns. Instead of trying to copy exactly what one billionaire did, look at what tends to work across many people over long periods. Nobody makes only good decisions and gets only good luck, and nobody makes only bad decisions. So when you evaluate your own results and the results of others, leave a wide margin for the invisible hand of fortune in both directions. There is a particular kind of failure that fascinates Housel, and it is not the failure of the poor or the unlucky. It is the failure of people who already had more than almost anyone could ever spend, and who threw it all away reaching for even more. He points to men who sat atop the financial world, who were worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, respected, powerful, seemingly complete, and who committed fraud or crime to gain a little bit more. Why would someone with hundreds of millions risk their freedom and their reputation for another few million they did not need and could never meaningfully use? The answer is that they never developed a sense of enough. The goalpost kept moving. Every time they reached a number, the number they wanted grew, because their sense of satisfaction was tied not to their own life, but to comparison with others who had slightly more. This is one of the most dangerous forces in all of personal finance, the ceiling that keeps rising just out of reach so that you can never actually arrive. Housel argues that the hardest financial skill is getting the goalpost to stop moving, learning to feel that what you have is enough. And enough, he is careful to say, is not too little. It is not about deprivation or settling for less than you deserve. Enough is realizing that the opposite, an insatiable appetite for more, will push you to a point of regret. There are things that are never worth risking, no matter the potential gain. Reputation is one. Freedom is another. Family, friends, being loved by the people you want to love you, and your own happiness. The way to keep those safe is to know when you have enough, to stop playing a game whose only prize is the anxiety of playing it forever. The saddest fortunes in the book do not belong to people who lost money. They belong to people who had everything and still felt poor. If there is one idea in this book that could quietly change the trajectory of your entire financial life, it is this one, and it is almost embarrassingly boring. It is compounding. Housel makes the point by examining the most famous investor of the modern age. This man is worth something on the order of $80+ billion. But here is the detail almost everyone misses. The overwhelming majority of that wealth, tens of billions of it, was earned after his 65th birthday. He is not merely a great investor. He is a great investor who has been investing since he was a child, for the better part of 80 years. His skill produced good annual returns, but it was time, the sheer relentless length of his investing life, that turned those returns into an almost supernatural fortune. Housel runs a thought experiment. If this man had started investing in his 30s like a normal person and retired in his 60s, keeping the very same returns, his net worth would be a tiny fraction of what it actually is, a rounding error by comparison. The engine of his wealth was not a higher rate of return. It was the number of years he let the returns keep building on themselves. This is the counterintuitive truth about compounding. Its results are not linear, and they do not feel dramatic in any single year. They come from a small effect repeated for an unreasonably long time, until suddenly the totals become absurd. Our brains are simply not wired to grasp this. We are drawn to the impressive, the aggressive, the trader who doubled their money in a year. But the real money is made by people who earn merely decent returns and then, crucially, refuse to interrupt them. The lesson is that good investing is not necessarily about earning the highest returns. It is about earning pretty good returns that you can sustain and can keep untouched for the longest possible period. Time is the ingredient that does the heavy lifting, and it is available to almost everyone if only they can leave it alone. This leads directly into a distinction that Housel treats as fundamental, the difference between getting wealthy and staying wealthy. These are two entirely different skills. Getting money requires taking risks, being optimistic, and putting yourself out there. Keeping money requires the opposite. It requires humility, a touch of fear, and an acceptance that whatever you have built can be taken away just as quickly as it came. Getting money is about being bold. Keeping it is about survival. And survival, he insists, is the single most important element of any long-term financial plan. The reason so many people who get rich do not stay rich is that they apply the same aggressive mindset that made them money to the job of protecting it, and that aggression eventually blows them up. The most important thing you can do is ensure that you never have to sell at the worst possible moment, never get wiped out, never be forced out of the game. Because compounding only works if you give it years and decades, and the only way to give it years and decades is to survive every crisis in between. This is why Housel admires financial approaches that might look overly cautious. He wants a plan that plans for the plan not going according to plan. He wants people to build in a margin of safety, to keep more cash than seems strictly rational, to avoid single points of failure, and to be, as he puts it, financially unbreakable. The optimist who is also paranoid about the short term, who believes the future will be good but knows the road there will be brutal, is the one who lasts. Getting wealthy makes for exciting stories. Staying wealthy is quiet, unglamorous, and it is where nearly all the real, durable fortunes are actually made and kept. One of the most liberating ideas in the book is the notion that a tiny handful of events account for the majority of all outcomes. Housel calls this the power of tails, the extreme events at the far ends of any distribution. Think about a venture investor who backs 100 startups. The vast majority will do nothing, break even, or fail outright. But a small few, maybe one or two, will become enormous, and those one or two will produce almost all of the returns for the entire portfolio. The same is true of the stock market as a whole. A small percentage of companies account for nearly all the market's long-term gains. And it is true within great careers, within the work of famous artists, within almost every domain where results compound over time. What this means for the ordinary person is deeply reassuring. You do not have to be right most of the time. You can be wrong, even frequently, and still do extraordinarily well, as long as you are present and invested when the rare, enormous winners arrive. Housel points out that even the greatest investors are wrong a huge share of the time. What separates them is not a high batting average. It is that they own the few things that matter when those few things pay off spectacularly, and they do not get scared out of the game before then. This reframes how we should think about our own mistakes. In a world driven by tales, a long series of small failures and disappointments is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It may simply be the ordinary texture of a strategy that will be defined, in the end, by a small number of exceptional moments. The trick is to keep showing up, to keep buying, to keep participating, so that you are still in the room when the tail event finally happens. Missing those few days, those few decisions, those few companies, is what quietly separates good outcomes from mediocre ones. Now we come to what Housel considers the true purpose of money, and it is not a yacht or a mansion or a designer watch. The highest form that money can buy, he argues, is control over your own time. The ability to wake up in the morning and say, I can do what I want, when I want, with whom I want, for as long as I want. That, he writes, is priceless, and it is the highest dividend money pays. Study after study on human happiness points in this direction. A strong sense of controlling your own life is a more reliable predictor of feeling good about your life than almost any specific circumstance, including how much you earn or the size of your house. What people crave, more than luxury itself, is autonomy. And yet the modern economy has, in some ways, quietly stolen this from us. We may have larger homes and better gadgets than our grandparents, but many of us have less control over our time, always reachable, always half-working, our attention leased out to a job that follows us home in our pocket. Housel's insight is that using your money to buy time and options is almost always a better deal, in terms of happiness, than using it to buy more stuff. The person who saves enough to have flexibility, to change careers, to weather an emergency, to retire on their own terms, to take a lower-paying job they love, is buying something far more valuable than the person who spends the same money on visible luxuries. This is a reframing of the entire point of getting money. The goal is not to accumulate things. The goal is to accumulate freedom. Every dollar you save is a piece of your future that you own outright, a small purchase of independence. And independence, the quiet power to steer your own days, is the richest thing that money can actually deliver. Here is one of the sharpest and most useful ideas in the whole book, and it cuts against nearly everything our culture teaches us. Housel draws a hard line between being rich and being wealthy, and they are not the same thing at all. Rich is a current income. If someone drives an expensive car and lives in a big house, we can reasonably guess they earn a lot of money right now. But wealth is different. Wealth is the money you have not spent. It is the cars not bought, the upgrades declined, the income that was converted into savings and investments instead of into things. And here is the crucial part. Wealth is invisible. It is, by its very nature, the stuff you cannot see, because the moment you spend it on something visible, it stops being wealth. The person with the flashy car has shown you exactly one thing, that they have less money than they did before they bought it. We build our whole idea of what success looks like by observing the people around us, but we can only observe what they spend, never what they keep. So we assume that the visible spenders are the wealthy ones, and we try to imitate them, and in doing so we often spend our way out of the very wealth we are chasing. Real wealth, Housel says, is the nice things not bought, the restraint that never gets posted or photographed. It is invisible, sitting quietly in accounts, generating options and security that nobody else can see. This connects to his most practical advice of all, which is simply to save. And he adds a beautiful twist. You do not need a specific reason to save. Saving simply for the sake of having a buffer against life's surprises, for the flexibility it buys, is one of the most powerful financial habits there is. Your savings rate, he argues, is far more within your control than your investment returns, and it matters more than most people realize. The gap between your ego and your income is your savings, and building wealth has less to do with how much you make and much more to do with how much of it you can resist spending to impress people who are not even looking. The final cluster of ideas is about how to actually live with money in an uncertain world, and it starts with an unexpected admission. Housel says do not aim to be coldly rational with your money. Aim instead to be reasonable. The purely rational investor, on paper, should chase every last fraction of return and feel nothing when markets crash. But you are not a spreadsheet. You are a person who has to sleep at night and stay committed to a plan for decades. Housel confesses that his own family paid off their house early, keeping a large chunk of money in a home instead of in investments that would probably have earned more. On paper, that is a poor decision. But it lets him sleep, and that feeling of independence keeps him calm through every market storm and keeps him from doing something truly destructive out of panic. A reasonable strategy you can stick with beats a rational one you will abandon the moment it becomes uncomfortable. The best plan is the one that lets you stay in the game, which means it has to fit your emotions, not just your logic. Alongside this comes his emphasis on room for error, on building a margin of safety into everything. The future is not going to match your forecast, so you should never plan as if it will. Leaving a gap between what you expect and what could happen gives you the endurance to survive the surprises that history guarantees will come. And there is a subtle, related point about how we should regard the ups and downs of investing. Market volatility, the sickening drops and lurches, is not a fine, a punishment for doing something wrong. It is a fee, the price of admission for the good returns that come over the long run. The investor who understands that the declines are simply the cost of the ticket will pay it willingly and stay seated. The one who mistakes it for a penalty will keep trying to dodge it, and in doing so will trade away the very returns they came for. Reasonableness, a margin for error, and the willingness to pay the emotional fee of volatility are what allow an ordinary person to survive long enough for compounding to do its quiet, extraordinary work. Let me gather the threads of this book into the lessons worth carrying with you. The first takeaway is that behavior beats brilliance. You do not need to be a genius to do well with money, and being a genius will not save you if you cannot control your own emotions. Temperament matters more than intelligence, and self-restraint matters more than technical skill. The second takeaway is to define your enough. Decide what a good life actually requires for you, and then let the goalposts stop moving, so that you are not sacrificing the things that truly matter, your integrity, your freedom, your relationships, in pursuit of a number that will only keep receding. The third takeaway is to respect the twin forces of luck and risk. Stay humble when you succeed, stay compassionate when others fail, and always leave room for the fact that the world is less controllable than it feels. The fourth takeaway is to let compounding work, which mostly means getting out of its way. Earn decent, durable returns, and then guard the one ingredient that makes them magical: time. Do not interrupt it unnecessarily. The fifth takeaway is to prize survival above all. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are different skills, and staying wealthy is built on humility, caution, and an unbreakable refusal to be knocked out of the game. Plan for the plan not going to plan. The sixth takeaway is to save without needing a reason. Your savings rate is your most powerful and most controllable financial lever, and every dollar saved is a purchase of future freedom. The seventh takeaway is to spend money on control over your time, because autonomy is the highest dividend money pays and the most reliable path to actually feeling content. The eighth takeaway is that true wealth is invisible, so stop trying to imitate the visible spending of others, because you have no idea what lies beneath it, and the game of impressing strangers is one you can never win. And the final takeaway is to be reasonable rather than perfectly rational. Choose a strategy you can hold onto through fear and boredom and doubt. Build in a margin of safety. Treat volatility as the fee and not the fine, and give yourself the endurance to stay invested across the decades that really count. When you step back from the psychology of money, you notice that Housel has quietly performed a kind of trick on the reader. He promised a book about finance, and he delivered a book about human nature. He got you thinking you would learn about markets, and instead he taught you about ego, fear, patience, envy, and the strange stories we tell ourselves. That is the whole point. Money is one of the most emotional forces in our lives, and pretending otherwise, treating it as a purely mathematical puzzle to be optimized, is exactly how so many brilliant people end up broke and so many humble people end up quietly secure. The janitor with $8 million did not have a special formula. He had frugality, patience, and time, applied without drama for decades. The Wall Street executive who went bankrupt did not lack knowledge. He lacked the behavioral guardrails that would have protected him from himself. That contrast is the whole book in miniature. What I find most freeing about Housel's message is that it puts good financial outcomes within reach of almost anyone, regardless of how clever they are or how much they earn. You do not need to predict the future, beat the market, or understand complicated instruments. You need to spend less than you make, save the difference, invest it in a reasonable way, leave it alone for a very long time, avoid catastrophic mistakes, and keep your own envy and impatience from talking you into something foolish. That is a set of behaviors, not a set of talents. And behaviors can be learned, practiced, and chosen. So the invitation this book leaves you with is not to become a better analyst. It is to become a better behavior. To figure out what enough looks like for you, to buy back control of your own time, to build wealth quietly where no one can see it, and to hold your nerve through the storms so that the slow, patient miracle of compounding has the room it needs to work. Do those unglamorous things for long enough, and you will discover what Housel has been telling you all along, that the psychology of money, far more than the mathematics of it, is what determines whether money makes your life freer or makes it smaller. The choice, reassuringly, is mostly about how you behave.